Kids in Washington could soon be apologizing at public school for being white. I'm Andrew Esquire, and this is the Legal Mindset, where we help you be your own judge. So you may have heard about critical race theory. You may have heard about how crazy it is, but soon it could be law in a lot of states, especially the left-leaning Western states. So let's talk about that. And let's talk about how that's an issue and how some states are reacting to that issue. So critical race theory. Now, you may think, okay, equity is great, right? Equity sounds like a cool thing. We gotta understand there's a big difference between equity, which is what's being pushed by critical race theory, versus equality. So equity and equality are not the same thing. Equity is totally different in that equality means, hey, we all have the same opportunities. There's no barrier to entry. Nobody's holding you back. Nobody's saying you can't do anything. And that's great. We all agree with that. The civil rights movement went far in establishing that. Hey, it shouldn't matter where you come from, what you believe in, what your background is. You should have the same opportunity. And I think everybody else believes in that. Everybody I know believes in that. However, equity, at least how it's put forward by critical race theory, attempts to say, hey, we should all get the exact same outcome. And any reason that we don't get the exact same outcome is solely due to race and racial differences. And particularly the projects like the 1619 Project, which has been pushed on education throughout the United States in certain places, that says that America is fundamentally racist, and there's fundamental issues that need to be addressed by all Americans regarding that specifically, and that African Americans are specifically disadvantaged in a way that goes beyond all other races. And in fact, it's much worse than any other race. So sorry Latinos, sorry Native Americans, sorry Asians, no, your racism is much less than the specific racism for African Americans. And that's problematic for many reasons. But what's more problematic is this type of curriculum is going to be pushed in certain states, like Washington, which just passed a bill, Senate Bill 5044, which mandates training in critical race theory for educators. Now, they don't specifically say the word critical race theory, but they do say things like they need training in the institutional racism of the education system, and they need specific training in inclusion, diversity, and anti-racism to correct institutional and systemic errors in education. I agree that our education system, particularly our public school education system, needs reform. It needs restructuring. It needs to be modernized. We're working under a system that really worked hundreds of years ago and does need to be modernized. But what needs to be modernized is the curriculum, is the way we teach, the way we devote the time, the way we just think about the education as a whole. Is it getting us the results we want? And that's something I can get behind. But what I can't get behind is that all the issues with education, all of the issues with the way that outcomes are happening through our education system is solely based on racism. That's a little bit where you lose me. And a lot of other states would agree. But let's go back to Washington, because they don't agree. And Governor Inslee definitely does not agree with that. He actually says that teachers are now mandated under this new bill, mandated to spend a day specifically on cultural sensitivity and essentially critical race theory training, which is huge. It is massive. And part of this is a push that's in line with what Joe Biden is doing. As we went through the executive orders of Joe Biden, the majority of them focused on equity. They used that equity term. And I'm mentioning it now, and I'm going to continue to mention it because it's so radical and so different. And you've really got to understand that difference. And yes, I know it sounds okay, but it's much different in outcome. Another thing that's happening in Washington is they're pushing a similar bill regarding healthcare. Yes, a racism in healthcare bill that says, hey, healthcare, systemically racist, super bad for African Americans more than everybody else, and we need to correct that. Why is this an issue? Well, this is an issue for many reasons, but let's just focus on some that are more obvious. Well, the first is that, well, it violates the Constitution. It's unconstitutional. Why is it unconstitutional? Well, for a lot of reasons. First of all, you could think about First Amendment. First Amendment protects your views and really protects you from being infringed on by other people's views. You're not forced to adopt other people's views. But imagine you're a teacher. Imagine you're in Washington and you're forced to go to this training day. And you're forced to admit, because you happen to be a white teacher, that, hey, you're racist. Well, you don't believe that. You don't fundamentally believe that you are a racist, but you're forced to say, hey, because I'm white, I'm a big racist. It doesn't matter if you voted for Joe Biden, it doesn't matter how liberal you are. You're white, you're racist. Well, that's a huge issue. That's a First Amendment issue because you're being forced to do something that you really fundamentally don't agree with. And there's other issues with this. There's also big Civil Rights Act violations. Yeah, Civil Rights Act, that's kind of crazy. The Civil Rights Act applying in this case, isn't this supposed to protect civil rights? Well, no, like I said, it's different than how the Civil Rights Act worked. The Civil Rights Act simply said that you can't discriminate on the basis of race, national origin, religion, but the Civil Rights Act doesn't allow a single race to be promoted above others. So by saying, hey, African Americans, you're way above everybody else in terms of how bad you've been treated. You're way higher, therefore we have to give you special benefits. That actually violates the Civil Rights Act. In fact, they're giving preferential treatment over other minorities. That is blatantly unconstitutional. Now, there's also issues with the 14th Amendment because, once again, it's forced speech, it's compelled speech. But what are other states doing about this? Because other states have heard about this. So what are some states doing about this? Well, a lot of states are banning it, they're barring it. Let's say you're in Oklahoma City. And Oklahoma City typically leans a little bit more blue than the rest of Oklahoma. And let's say the school district wanted to pass this in Oklahoma City. Oklahoma banned this type of critical race theory and banned promoting the plight of one particular group over another or forcing one particular group to admit that they're racist. That is something that is not going to happen in Oklahoma. Arizona, Texas, Tennessee followed suit, and many other states are following suit in barring this type of provision in education or in training for education. So for example, if you train the teachers, that's just as bad as training the students because the teachers are going to go ahead and pass that information on to the students. And what are we seeing here? What we're seeing here is really led by the huge agenda from the federal government. And you have to go back to the first actions, the very first actions that were started by Joe Biden. Now, I went over this in my video with Biden's big changes. You can go back there. But really, if you look at the very, very first actions, they were all about equity. So we're going to see a huge push on this, and we may see a massive push via an executive order from the federal government.